Welcome to another round of Grudge Match, the show that asks what would happen if characters universes apart were able to meet face-to-face and fight for supremacy. Today's contest is between two villains with extremely potent power sets that are almost identical. DC comes out swinging with the Mudman of Malevolence, Clayface, and Marvel answers right back with its granulated gladiator, Sandman. Taking a look at Clayface first, he was created originally in 1940 and went under the name Basil Carlo. Now, originally in his creation, Clayface didn't have any superpowers. It was just a name and a mask that the character wore to go around committing crimes. Over the years, there have been many different characters to take on the name of Clayface, and it wasn't until years after the character's initial creation in 1940 that the other characters began developing the powers more commonly associated with Clayface. And then once they did, they formed alliances with the original Clayface, Basil Carlo, and he used their powers to adopt his own set of abilities that mirrored the basic powers that Clayface is most usually associated with. Things like body malleability and having a clay-like body that he can use and turn into anything he wishes. But since there's been so many different Clayfaces over the years, the powers and vulnerabilities of the character very often change from incarnation to incarnation, and even in the different appearances of the same character, his powers and weaknesses can change from appearance to appearance. So it can be very difficult to lock down the exact specifics of both the powers and weaknesses of Clayface at any given time. But things that generally remain the same are his ability to change his body into anything he wants, general shape-shifting ability, size and density control, and superhuman strength, durability, and stamina. Sandman's real name is William Baker, and he was created in 1963. Now, before he gained his powers and became a consummate Spider-Man villain, he was a small-time criminal, and so he took on many different aliases over the time, including the alias of Flint Marko, a name he most normally went under. But his real name is William Baker. And one time when he was escaping from the police who were out to apprehend him, he took refuge on a beach that seemed to be deserted, but it was being used for military testing, and his body got irradiated by way of the radioactive weapons they were using, and that caused his body to merge with the sand of the beach itself, and he became Sandman, with the ability to turn his body into sand and then have body malleability to shapeshift himself into any solid object he could imagine, and he most often changes his hands into various weapons that he uses to fight off his enemies. Now, both of these characters possess the same basic overall power set in terms of being able to shapeshift and turn their bodies into malleable forms. With Clayface, he turns himself into a mud-like clay substance, Sandman turning himself into sand. But both have the same basic effect on their physiology. They can then change their size, shape, density, and turn their body parts into any kind of weapons they can imagine and use them in combat. They do have a few different ways they utilize their powers. Clayface can not only create different types of weapons out of himself, but he's better with general shape-shifting. Sandman himself can't really turn himself into other people and blend into crowds in that way, whereas Clayface can. He can look like anyone he wishes, he can shrink himself down from his larger Clayface state to look like a normal human, and be indistinguishable from other people, and he can also take on other personas. Basil Carlo was a skilled actor before he ever became a supervillain, so he's very good at impersonating other people. Additionally, Clayface has developed an ability to wither organic matter. He has a touch that is poisonous and can reduce human flesh down to protoplasm just with a mere touch. However, that's not really an ability that would come into play against Sandman, as Sandman is not really composed of organic matter. His body is made up of sand particles. Additionally, Clayface is able to separate himself into multiple forms. In times in the comics, the cartoons, and the video games, he's able to create smaller versions of himself and send those out to do his bidding. So he can break himself down into multiple parts, whereas Sandman always needs to keep himself into one large mass. Now, Sandman has an ability that Clayface doesn't, and that is to take on other amounts of sand that happen to be around him and use that to increase his own size and density. If there is enough sand in the immediate area, he can grow to mammoth proportions and turn his entire body into really powerful sandstorms. So that's an ability that Sandman has in his corner that Clayface doesn't share. Clayface always tends to be relatively the same basic size. He can make himself appear bigger or smaller, but that's more about changing the density of himself rather than actually taking on other clay or mud that happens to be around him and adding it to his own bulk. So having examined the differences and the similarities of these two characters, it's time now to determine a winner. That winner is going to be Clayface. The reason Clayface walks away as the winner of this grudge match is because his weaknesses are much more inconsistent, whereas Sandman's weaknesses tend to always be the same. It's difficult to say at any given time what would be a weakness that would enable Sandman to defeat Clayface. Whereas Sandman has always had the same two basic weaknesses, and that is extreme heat and water. If he's exposed to extreme levels of heat, just like when sand is exposed to extreme levels of heat, it will cause him to melt and fuse together in a glass state, and that will make him immobile once it hardens. Additionally, an even easier way to combat Sandman is by getting him wet. If he has gotten wet enough, then he loses control of the sand particles of his body. He becomes kind of a mud-like state himself, and he doesn't have the ability to control himself when in that state. Now, these are the kind of weaknesses that Clayface doesn't share. There have been times he's been shown to have problems keeping himself together when immersed in water. Other times, he moves right through water with no problem. And there have been times he's been shown to have problems adapting to electricity. Other times he has no problem being electrocuted. So it's really difficult to tell what kind of weaknesses Clayface would have at any given time. Whereas Clayface would just have to find a water source, get Sandman wet, and that will instantly lessen Sandman's ability to control himself and utilize his powers. So based on that, Clayface is going to go home the winner of this grudge match. So message me down below, let me know what you think of the outcome of this grudge match and any suggestions for upcoming episodes. We'll see you next time on the next edition of Grudge Match.